I'm looking at the C-SPAN swag shop. There's some great stuff here.
Oh, it's amazing. For Valentine's Day a couple of years ago, my kids made me a card that suggested I was actually in love, not with my wife, but with C-SPAN. I have C-SPAN mugs. I have C-SPAN totes. I have C-SPAN everything.
There's this color-blocked Warhol-style C-SPAN sweatshirt. It whips.
Jamelle may have found his Christmas gift list.
From New York Times Opinion, I'm Carlos Lozada.
I'm Michelle Cottle.
I'm Ross Douthat.
And this is Matter of Opinion. All right, so I have to confess, I don't really have a plan for what we're going to do in this episode of Matter of Opinion. I do have the concept of a plan.
Oh.
Ba-dum-bum.
And the concept of a plan, I hear, is just as good as an actual plan.
It's the same thing.
The first part of that concept is having invited our esteemed colleague and friend of the Moo, Jamelle Bouie, to join us today. Welcome back, Jamelle.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So we're talking at the end of debate week, part one or part two. I don't know what it is. The punditocracy consensus, including that of the almighty New York Times Opinion scorecard, seems to be that Kamala Harris won this debate rather handily. So I want us to get into how she did that, but I also hope we can talk about what it actually means to, quote unquote, win a debate, particularly in a country that is so split, and how much this debate performance in early to mid-September will affect what happens when people are actually voting. So that's the plan, or the concept of a plan. Does that sound okay to folks?
Absolutely not. I'm out.
I always suspected that about you, Ross. All right, so first, let's get into how Harris won. When we remember presidential debates, we often look back on sort of a key moment, a key exchange that helped define the candidates for good or for ill. There was Reagan's joke about how Mondale lacked the, age and experience to be president. Mitt Romney's binders full of women. So now with, the benefit of a day and a half or so to process this debate, I'm wondering, is there a moment for Harris that stood out for you that you think maybe captures why it is she was able to win this debate?
Jamelle, you get to go first.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I'm not sure I would say that there's a singular moment. I think the specific approach she took to most of the questions was to do basically this, to answer every question with a bit of biography and then demonstrating, some progress on the issue, drawing a contrast with Trump, and then attempting to bait him in one way or another. And the bait was important, right? Because when Trump took it, but he just ate up time he could have used to execute whatever strategy the campaign had for him.
Yeah, I think it was all about the baiting. And she just, she took a dig at his rallies. And you could just see this, it's this moment where it's like, can Trump resist taking that bait? And he had a clear opportunity because the next question from the moderator was about immigration, which is generally a good issue for him, right? And from there, you were sort of off to the races with this answer that encompassed his grievance about his rallies being underestimated, and then went back to immigration with the claims that Haitian immigrants are killing and eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio. It was uncut Trump. And I've watched many, many Donald Trump debate performances, and he never avoids sort of being himself in these debates. But yeah, that to me was sort of the pivot point where it was like, all right, we're off to the races here.
So I think the way she generally won was that Trump is an unconventional debater and everybody freaks out because even if he's not answering your question in the way that a normal candidate would, he looks like he is controlling the discussion or controlling the entire spectacle. And at no point during this debate did he look in control, much less like he was controlling the situation.
He controlled the time, right? He spoke way more than she did. If you were doing it,
there's a
time of
difference
possession,
between sucking up the time and controlling it. And the way that I know that this really hit home is every one of my extremely Republican family members were so disgusted, they couldn't even watch. They're just like, they cut off.
you guys are doing the same thing that happened in the debate. I asked you a question about Harris, and this whole discussion largely has been about Trump, about how Trump reacted to Harris. So I'm gonna suggest one moment that spoke to me from what Harris said, and that's when one of the moderators asks Harris about Trump's denial of the election results. And she has this line where she says, Trump was fired by 81 million people, looking back on the 2020 election. So of course that was sort of a play off the "you're fired" catchphrase. But what I liked about it is that she turned that into a bigger critique of Donald Trump. In the third Clinton-Trump debate, when Trump says that he wouldn't necessarily respect the outcome of the election, Clinton said what you would imagine her to say, this is horrifying, he's denigrating our democracy. Harris made the same point about we have to respect the will of the people, but she turned it into a broader critique of Trump. She said, look, he lacks not just the temperament to be president, but the ability to recognize facts. He seems confused by facts. And so she turned that moment not just into the familiar debate about Trump being anti-democratic, as important as that is, but into a bigger debate about just his lacking the sort of mental acuity to be president of the United States. And I thought that was smart, but you all want to talk about Trump, so great. What did Trump have any moment that
we
you
can
felt
let's wait. We can talk. No, Carlos, we can talk more about Harris. I'm not. It's the method by which she won the debate did involve letting Trump talk a lot. But I think generally what you would say, and this is not a moment, but it is a reality, right, is that there weren't any Veep moments for Harris, right?
You mean like the word salad kind of moments?
The word salad kind of things, the thing where she's like, as to regards the twirling towards freedom, we must enter the 21st century, that kind of thing. Like, no, she was very fluent. She was prosecutorial, but with a light touch. I'm a pretty big Harris skeptic, and she certainly exceeded my expectations in terms of not being the Veep version of herself. And that's a good thing for her and her campaign.
So Trump attempted to tie Harris to Joe Biden in very sort of blunt terms. He frequently referred to Biden as, your boss, and at one point said, remember, she is Biden. And, that led to her saying like, well, you may have noticed I'm not Joe Biden. How important is it for Trump to tie Harris to Biden? And how important is it for Harris to keep her distance from her, in fact, boss?
Well, extremely important because this is a change election, right? And one of the things that has frustrated Trump so is he was all ready to just blame everything that was wrong in the country on Biden. And he has many times said, well, if I were in charge, nothing bad would have ever happened. So that's more complicated with Kamala. And what you see him trying to do is just ask over and over again, well, you've been there for 3.5 years. Why haven't you fixed it already? Now, I know this is hard for him. She's not the president. She's the vice president. And the vice president doesn't make policy or guide the direction of the government. But it is an important attempt by him to say that she is the same thing as Biden, and he's fairly desperate to do it.
Well, and I mean, and she also has not distanced herself in any substantial or meaningful way from the Joe Biden administration. So yes, if her formal agenda is similar to the formal Biden agenda, then why haven't you done it is, I think, a reasonable distillation of the question that you would ask.
That question
I think
would
this
be,
is
why
obviously
hasn't Biden done it?
I just think you're letting Harris off the hook in this sort of silly way.
I'm letting Harris
like,
off the hook because he's trying to suggest that as vice
it's
president,
like you're a debate moderator here. That's all I'm saying.
Oh my God!
It's
Did
like you're an
you
ABC
suggest the
debate
debate was
moderator.
rigged, Ross? In Kamala's favor?
It's all rigged.
Oh, poor Trump.
I will just chime in to add that I don't think Harris has made concerted effort to distance herself from the positions of the Biden administration. And I'm not actually sure that she should, right? I think she should talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. I think she should talk about the CHIPS Act. I think she should talk about the attempt to forgive student loans. I think these are things that the public doesn't necessarily know about, and it's worth trying to tout them. I think the place where Harris is trying to present herself as a candidate of change is, and she made this point during the debate, is generationally. I think this is kind of the rhetorical posture that she's taking, not necessarily that she represents a policy departure from Biden. And I'll say, this is my own view, this election has had a lot of talk about policy specificity in a way that I find very strange, having covered plenty of presidential elections where neither voters nor reporters really cared all that much. So I kind of think that the policy specificity thing is sort of like a fig leaf or red herring for something else that people are concerned about. But in any case, I think Harris is focused less on trying to distance herself from Biden on policy and saying, listen, don't you want to go forward with someone who doesn't represent the past, especially someone who doesn't represent, who represents, in Trump's case, a past that you disliked enough to knock him out of office already.
What's interesting about that is that it's the most benign kind of distance she can create between herself and Joe Biden, right? It's nothing about what Joe did. It's just that he's older and I'm not. But the irony of this kind of like, distance from Biden thing is that she's basically running the Biden campaign strategy. When the Biden campaign wanted to move the debate forward, one of the most fateful decisions in recent American political history, it was because they thought they would benefit from emphasizing the contrast between here's crazy Trump and sober Joe. And that backfired massively because of Biden's age and his condition. But Harris is doing the same thing. Even though she's the VP in the incumbent administration, she's making the campaign entirely about Trump. That's what Biden wanted to do. She's just much better at it.
But Biden was very invested in making the Trumpian threat to democracy central because he felt like that had worked for him in 2020 and had sort of saved a bunch of Democratic Senate seats in 2022, right? And with Harris, that theme is still there. It showed up in the debate, but it's more of a sub-theme and I agree with Jamelle here, this sort of larger, Trump is weird and freaky and reactionary, and J.D. Vance is weird and freaky and reactionary, and we are the new generation of the American future that you voters want, right? And by the way, Trump doesn't respect democracy and he'll be dangerous in office. But where you're laying the emphasis has changed, and Biden couldn't do a sort of generational change argument because obviously he was, ancient and decrepit. So that is, I think, a meaningful shift. And one I think it has been helpful to the Democrats. I am very, very skeptical, though, that Harris's debate victory will meaningfully shift the campaign. I'm just skeptical that that is enough to get over the substantive problem the Democrats have, which, to Jamelle's point, is not a problem about specific nitty-gritty policy, but it is a problem of issue areas. Voters are dissatisfied with how the economy has performed because of inflation. They're dissatisfied with immigration policy, and they're dissatisfied with the fact that the international landscape is pretty dark and grim right now. And those are problems that I'm just not sure you finesse by saying Trump is old and weird and I'm a new generation. I think there's just limits to what Harris achieved, but we'll see.
I think on immigration and the border, I actually think the Harris answer is a good one, right? Emphasizing this piece of legislation that Trump did literally kill. And it emphasizes the larger point she's making about Trump, which is that this is just a guy who's not actually interested in solving problems. So I think that's an effective answer. I think where Harris still has trouble is on the economy and on inflation. And the truth of the matter that inflation was a global problem, that the Federal Reserve and the administration have successfully gotten it down to normal levels, doesn't deal with sort of the visceral thing that they're, these price changes, things are more expensive. The fact that wages have gone up above and beyond inflation, again, doesn't really resonate with people who see the price of something. So I do think she needs a better answer on that. And although people interested in policy don't like it, the price gouging, I'm going to deal with price gougers, that's probably her best approach in terms of just trying to persuade voters that she has a solution. Because the fact of the matter is that people, when they think about a problem, they imagine a villain. It's hard to convince people that a problem is a function of larger structural forces. And so Harris saying, well, it's an evil corporation who's raising the price of groceries is probably her best option when it comes to trying to deal with that particular issue problem.
Which is a kind of the flip side of Trump blaming everything on immigrants.
Right.
Jamelle, you expressed understandable perplexity at the sort of popularity of policy specificity. Suddenly Americans are all wonks and want to know exactly what she thinks about X, Y, or Z. I think part of that question is a proxy for just a sort of gut check trust level that voters might feel they need with Kamala Harris. She didn't go through the sort of trial by fire of a primary campaign in 2024 that would have required her to be clearer on a set of issues and contrast them with other approaches within the party. I mean, that was one of the questions in the debate. I think it was Lindsey Davis who sort of laid out, when you ran for president last time, you said, this on a series of issues, whether fracking or anything else. And now you have a very different position. Like, where did that come from? And all she could say was this thing about like, my values haven't changed. And it's sort of very generic and amorphous. And I think that makes people wonder a little bit, well, how much can we trust what she is saying today? And lacking the primary campaign, we didn't get a lot of clarity on that this time around. But Ross raised the question of, to what extent this debate is going to mean much for the campaign going forward. And I want us to move to that. We'll take a quick break here. And when we're back, we'll look at what this debate did or did not reveal about what Trump and Harris and their campaigns are going to do in the next 7 weeks we have left. So on a week like this, it feels like the debate is everything, right? But in the end, it is only one moment in a longer campaign. Is there anything about what you saw this week in the debate and its aftermath that you think is revealing about what these two campaigns are trying to do or will need to do moving forward?
Well, Harris is still going to have to do a little bit of introducing herself and making people comfortable with her. I do think that your point about having not gone through a primary is spot on, Carlos. People don't really know her. I mean, people often don't know the VP except through bad jokes and memes. I mean, Mike Pence was a complete joke. Dan Quayle was a complete joke, except for Dick Cheney, who was terrifying at the time.
Still is.
It's true.
Harris Cheney 2024.
He's off stage now.
Oh, sure. That's what he wants you to think.
So, yeah, she still needs to do that. They could do some friendly town halls that wouldn't terrify her too much, where you're answering voter questions. Having her seen is good. People need to see her.
I think that's exactly right. I think town halls are actually a great idea. I think she'd actually do pretty well in the town hall format. Friendly interviews. Obviously, and this is, if Kamala Harris wants to give me an interview, happy to do it.
Here. She could be our guest next week, too.
But even non-traditional venues, I'm a big believer that she should go on Hot Ones.
Oh, yes. Yes, please.
She should do that kind of thing that reaches a broad audience. But being out there as much as possible, I really think is the path forward. And yes, it's understood that this is kind of crunch time for directly campaigning in key states. But, twice a week doing something like that, I think would redound quite well to her campaign's benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Harris is, pending post-debate polls, currently losing this election. I obviously think that she needs to take the risks of getting out more. The challenge for her campaign, though, is also, is there any way to sort of bait Trump outside the context of a presidential debate? Because there's an idea of Trump where he's sort of a vessel for discontents. And that's sort of the most potent version of Trump, where he's a little bit off stage. He's sort of a set of memes and images and sound bites. And if you're not happy with the direction of the country, you're like, all right, I'm going to throw in with him. And then there's the Trump from the second half of his convention speech or the debate stage where it's like, okay, this guy can't control himself and probably shouldn't be president. And those two Trumps sort of trade places periodically throughout presidential campaigns. And I think it's useful for the Democrats to have a final presidential debate 2 days before the election. We're not going to do that, but obviously. But that, I think
And half of America will have voted by then anyway.
No, that's true. That's the other thing, right? But Harris really does benefit from Trump in sort of full Trumpian flower, rambling in front of the public. And unfortunately, you can't necessarily make that happen at exactly the moment you want it to happen. But I think that's a reality of the election.
So it's to her advantage that both of them get seen.
Right. I mean, I think there are things Trump is doing that are smart. There was a clip that went viral on social media of him talking about drug and alcohol addiction, right, with some male podcaster. That kind of thing is helpful to him in doing outreach to male voters who lean his way and don't turn out at the same rate as, the Swifties, let's say, since I promised to bring up Taylor Swift at some point in this podcast, right?
I've been waiting for that.
But that is helpful to him. Doing normal political formats like debates, less helpful, and he's often better off sort of receding from those.
I'd say that Trump doing those sorts of podcasts is helpful. I watched his Theo Von interview, and he was like, it was good for him. I think the issue is that when you're thinking, trying to get the most votes, that young men are notoriously, right? It's not just that they don't turn out very much. They just don't vote.
Yep.
And so, I mean, if I were advising Trump, I would, urge him, he's never going to be on The View, but sort of if there's sort of a conservative view, right? That gets him in front of women inclined to vote for him. That would be helpful.
No way. No, this is fake. You're giving him fake bad advice, Jamelle. I don't believe you.
No, because
he should not be in front of women.
But women are the ones who vote, right? And so when you have limited time and limited resources, you go hunting where the ducks are.
So look, though, I was at a Moms for Liberty conference that he spoke at a couple of weeks ago, and that's exactly what he was there to do. He was there to court the conservative lasses. And now these were the faithful, though. But even in that extremely friendly arena where he was being tossed softballs by the moderator, he couldn't quite stay on message. And that was the event where the line came out of it where he was saying that you send your kids off to school and they come home 2 weeks later having had an operation. So he's having a little bit of trouble executing even in these really friendly areas.
Don't forget, Trump has been on The View many times.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been a while, I'm sure. But I wanted to ask just one more thing about Harris. When she makes the negative case against Trump, she can be very sharp, very specific. When she makes the affirmative case for herself, she is vague, almost platitudinous, these sort of generational changes, which, I don't know what that means aside from the fact that I'm younger, right? I have a hard time imagining that she can keep that up for the remainder of the campaign. Maybe that's just my wish casting. I don't want her to keep it up. I want her to get more specific. But to what extent does she need to do that?
So I think she should be seen and known better. I think I just disagree with the notion that being seen and known better means that you have to get specific about things. I'm just recalling the 2008 campaign where Barack Obama wasn't all that specific about anything, but did focus a lot on his biography and on this notion of changing the guard.
Exclusively on his biography.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the right approach for Harris, to get biographical, to talk about her background, talk about her upbringing, tie that into, the broad issues that people are concerned about, and do that in front of as many people as possible.
I mean, I think with presidential elections, that's kind of what you do because people aren't voting on very specific policies. When you talk to voters on the trail, you often run into situations where they have no idea what any of them have done. They have no idea what any of them plan to do. They know that's what they're supposed to say, but it's more that they like what that candidate represents.
I just want to add 2 points to this. I think they're really important points. The first, with voters, is I think that us in the press often underestimate the extent to which voters are performing what they think people in the press want to hear. It's not common to talk to a journalist. And so when you're talking to a journalist and you're just like a normal person, you're like, well, what kind of things do I say to a person who is a journalist? Having spoken to a lot of voters from the trail, when you go to talk to them, they're like, oh, I've never done this before. And so I think there's an element of performance in how voters respond to us. It's like really worth keeping in mind. The second thing is that we talk about FDR's 100 days as like a cliche at this point, but like the 1932 election, Roosevelt was not saying, if you elect me, I'm going to pass the National Industrial Recovery Act. Like, no, he was like, FDR said, literally, we need a new deal. We need more experimentation in government. We need an active government to address the problems of the people. And if you elect me, I will do those things. And I think the way we think about presidential candidates is just wrong these days. We want to talk about concrete agenda items more than we want to talk about how actually do they approach this job? How do they conceptualize it? What do they think about presidential power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all.
But look, like, I agree with both of those arguments. But FDR was running against Herbert Hoover, an incredibly unpopular incumbent, and Barack Obama was running de facto against George W. Bush, also a historically unpopular president, whereas Kamala Harris is the vice president for a historically unpopular president. And I 100% agree that she doesn't need like the 10-point plan to, fix the American economy and bring peace to the world. But it would be really helpful for her to be able to stand up and say, our border has been out of control. I'm going to control it. But to say all of that in a way, and this is the challenge, that draws a contrast with her own boss. It would be really helpful if she could just attack Joe Biden at some point in the next 6 weeks. And I understand all the reasons that seems impossible, but that's the core of her dilemma.
She doesn't need to attack him. She does need to draw a distinction. But that's not going to happen.
But she needs to concede that he has failed
I
in
think
some way. She doesn't have to say it. But people think he's failed.
Now you're the one giving Trixie advice now, Ross.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Ross.
Who can trust the pundits?
This is great. So politicians are performing for the public. The public is performing for journalists. Podcast hosts are performing for candidates. Everything is performative. That's my conclusion here. I'm gonna exercise moderator's prerogative here and ask you all: 1, is there one thing Harris needs to do to win? 2, is there one thing Trump needs to do to win? They have 7 weeks left. And offer non-disingenuous advice, please, everyone.
I want Harris to get out there more and be seen. And she doesn't have to talk policy nitty-gritty. She just needs to get people more comfortable with her.
Yeah, I would say that what Harris needs to do is essentially do a version in the culture, which she did on the debate stage, just sort of like take command. Vice versa, to Ross's point earlier, it is the case, it is true that when Trump recedes in public view, he does much better because like the image idea of Trump begins to sort of like become the thing that people think of. And so, in the last week or two, it would probably be to his benefit to just like go radio silent as much as possible.
Ross?
Yeah, to agree with Jamelle and I guess myself. I think if you go back and look at the transcript of the debate and look at Trump's closing statement, which is basically like, why hasn't she solved these things in the last 3 years? To the extent that he talks about policy in the next 6 weeks, that should be the only thing he ever says. That's his best chance for winning. And I already said that, Harris should burn Joe Biden in effigy at her next rally. So that's my totally sincere, nonpartisan advice to her.
All right. So bottom line, more Kamala Harris, less Donald Trump. There's your campaign strategy for the next month and a half.
For both of them.
All right. Let's leave it there. When we come back, we will get hot and cold. So finally, it is time, once again, for Hot Cold. Jamelle, just to remind you, this is where one of us shares something that we're really into or really, really not into, really over. Who is hot colding this week?
Oh, I have one.
Michelle, thank you.
So I am cold, chilly, frosty on these weird invitations I get to join online brand communities. So like this thing where I shop online and then I get these notes back that auto-generated. Would you like to join the community for, I don't know, yogurt or bamboo toothbrushes or, whatever like organic tube socks I have bought, and then go make your friends and swap recipes with these sponsored communities by the brands. And I'm just like, no, I do not want to give you my personal information any more than I already have so that you can stalk me and try and convince me to buy 65 more of your products. But it's also just like vaguely depressing that we have reached the point that we are finding our friends because they also buy this brand of olive oil. And that's how we're getting our community. I gotta say, just no.
Michelle, this reminds me of Robert Putnam and the collapse of third spaces, right? You guys, aren't you supposed to join stuff? Aren't you supposed to stop bowling alone? Don't you want to be part of communities?
I'm incredibly jealous. No brand has ever asked me to join their community. So basically, you are an in-demand influencer, and I am, nobody wants to be associated with Ross Douthat. That is what I'm taking away from this.
Jamelle, do you get these? Do you ever get these invitations? They're very strange. These auto-generated whatevers.
So I don't get any auto-generated stuff like that, but I'm really into menswear, and I do I follow menswear forums and I'm always talking to people about menswear online. I am part of a community of people who are into menswear and into cameras and stuff.
The only things I'm asked to join are communities around things that I actually truly care deeply about, like Notre Dame football fan communities, right?
Well, that's different.
No, it's still a thing that I'm being pitched on, but and also just random. One time, I don't know if this is real, but one time my sister and I were talking on the phone about this new gym that she joins, and it's a national chain thing, and I won't name it to denigrate it nor uphold it anyway. But then I hung up, and later that day I started getting Facebook ads for this place, and I just hadn't noticed them before, but it freaked me out.
My view is that if you're going to have that kind of surveillance capitalism, which we obviously do, that kind of thing happens to me all the time, they should at least invite me to join their damn communities.
Okay.
Right?
Anybody listening, please send Ross an invite. His feelings are hurt.
Ross wants more spam, is what he's saying. All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Jamelle, for joining us.
Jamelle.
And see you all next week.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks so much for joining our conversation. Please give Matter of Opinion a follow on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review while you're there to let folks know why they should listen in. Do you have any questions about what we talked about today? If you do, we want to hear it. So share it with us in a voicemail by calling 212-556-7440, and we just might respond in an upcoming episode. And of course, you can always email us at matterofopinion@nytimes.com. Matter of Opinion is produced by Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, Phoebe Lett, and Andrea Betanzos. It's edited by Jordana Hochman. Our ace fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Sonia Herrero, Carol Saburo, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Pat McCusker and Carol Saburo. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.